Thank you very much, Robin. I just need to correct two important details. I don't think that anybody gave an order to murder 200 prisoners of war. The whole thing is too complicated for me to go into here, but those of you that read the book will find the whole story in the introduction. But it's very important to say this, because I think you presented it as a black and white situation, and I think it was more complex.
Yes.
It's true that that was the moment that decided me against continuing to live in that society. It took me some time before I left Israel. But most of my life, I have lived in Britain. Now, please give me 14 minutes, which will be 2 minutes to 8, and then we'll ask questions about this section. Now, I think I should say first that what I try to do is use the IDF as a machinery of understanding Israel. You know, I'm less interested in the IDF per se. I'm not a military historian. What is interesting for me is Israel, Israeli society, its politics, its culture, or lack of it, and the way it takes decisions and where it gets them. And therefore, I thought for a long time about how to do it. I mean, some people use the kibbutz, for example. It's a very intelligent choice, but very inaccurate. The kibbutz is less than 1% of the Israeli society, was always not more than 1.5% of Israel's society. So to take the kibbutz as a model to explain Israeli society is totally wrong. But a lot of socialists did that because it spoke to them. They then missed most of the developments of the Israeli society because the kibbutz was such an isolated incident. And so many people took different models. I wanted to take the model that is the most inclusive. And therefore, I took the most important institution in that society, which is the IDF, and I will explain why. I'm just going to share my screen with you. Right. Now, in the 74 years, can you see my screen?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. In the 74 years which have passed, we have had many changes, and most of them are very dramatic. First, the society as such moved from the left to the right, and that is a total move. It's not a partial move. The society was run by the left for many years, for most of the history of Zionism up to that point. In 1948, it was run by the left and continued to be run by the left until the late 70s. When it moved to the right, the move was decisive. In the same way, it was mainly a society producing agricultural products. It was not highly mechanized or industrialized to begin with. But it moved to the opposite, from agriculture, you know, from the Jaffa oranges, which it stole from the Palestinians. It didn't even rename them. It stayed with that name. Now we know that Israel is famed for the arms trade, security, and basically spying on the citizens of many, many countries, including the leaders, as we know, from the Pegasus project. It was then, in 1948, a mainly secular society. The religious people of all colors included less than 12% of the population. Now they are well over 50%. So we moved from a secular society to a religious society. This has very important repercussions, which I will go into in a minute. And we moved from a socialized economy to a privatized economy. I don't need to explain that. Everyone in Britain understands this. Now, the one constant that remained in the 74 years is the IDF. This is quite incredible. This is the one institution that most Israelis are members of, and most of them are members of it for life. If they are males, definitely, but a lot of the women also. And it's the most widely participated in organization in Israel. So if you want to analyze Israel, you must first understand the IDF, and this is what I'm doing in the book. And just to give you an example, I don't know if this is big enough for you to see, but actually, which state institutions do Israeli trust? So the IDF, the blue line is Jewish, the green line is what they call Arabs, because they don't call them Palestinians, of course. There are no Palestinians in Israel, supposedly. So you can see that even about 40% of the so-called Arabs, when this was done, which was in 2019, which is probably a long time ago in terms of Israeli politics, 40% of the Palestinians, citizens of Israel, trusted the army. In terms of Israelis, Israeli Jews, it's close to 90%. So this is the only institution that 90% of Israeli Jews trust. And the political parties only are trusted by 14%. And here you see, you know, the graduation towards the political parties. You know, the president is trusted less than the IDF. The Supreme Court is trusted even less. The police is trusted even less, and so on. So this is a very interesting way of actually understanding what it is which actually makes the IDF such an important institution. Now, why is this happening? Well, it's very simple. Israel is the only settler colonial state which is still there from the 19th century. In the 20th century, we don't know, for example, if the Russians will colonize Ukraine. I don't want to even go there because this is going to take us from what we're talking about. But I don't think that we can talk about a lot of colonial projects in the 20th century. This is the most famous one and the most, you know, successful one. It is a very successful project. It made Israel from an insignificant state of nothing. You know, it's smaller than I think some of the counties in Britain. It's basically one of the leading political powers, irrespective of size, that exist in this world. That the country which itself is a war criminal, which houses millions of war criminals, is suggesting itself to negotiate peace between Russia and Ukraine, tells you what you need to know. So the first thing is, of course, you cannot have a settler colonial state without a very strong army to actually take over the land and dispossess the people. Think about Australia. Think about South Africa. Think about the best example of all, the United States, which of course I don't mean the United States, I mean North America, because the United States is its name after it liberated itself from the colonial country, Britain, and in some ways also France. But the United States is a result of not only taking over the territory, but actually a total ethnic cleansing and actually genocide of the local population. At least 15 million of the inhabitants of North America were exterminated like animals. This is the closest model to what the Zionists had in mind. And Herzl already wrote that in the 19th century, not in the 20th, in 1896, he describes how the country will be cleared of its population and will remain Jewish. The population will be spirited away, in a sense, to what he calls the transfer countries around Palestine. So this was the plan. The plan was not necessarily to kill the population, but to ethnic cleanse them. And that was successful. In 1948, 2/3 of Palestinians lost their homes and their country and their fields and their history and their memories and their life. So this is a successful, as far as Zionism is concerned, a successful operation. Now, I want to say in closing this that there are two models of colonization. The more normative model of colonization is occupying a country in order to exploit its resources and labor. That's what South Africans have done. They needed the Black people for one reason only, to work for them, so that through exploitation they can make a successful economy that enriches the minority, the white minority. All the labor will be done by the Black people who are just removed from slavery, in a sense. They didn't have any rights. Remember that the apartheid state, which was the worst example of that relationship in South Africa, started at the same time as Israel in 1948. Apartheid started in 1948 in Palestine and in South Africa. But this was a very different regime. Israel didn't want to exploit the Palestinians. It wanted to expel them. So these two models are very different. And that's why when you make comparisons to South Africa, you should be very particular and limit yourself, because otherwise you get into hot water without trying. Yeah. So the colonial models employed by Israel were more Australian or North American than the usual ones. As a result, today, there are 13 million people between the Jordan River and the sea, and half of them are Israeli Jews, and half of them are Palestinians, roughly. There are about 51%, depending which statistics you're looking at. The Israeli statistics is really lying, but there are about 51% Palestinian Arabs and 49% Israeli Jews between the river and the sea. And I'm about to finish the first part, so I'll just go 2 slides. Now, I want to say that no settler colonial enterprise is possible without an army, and Israel is no exception. It's just the best example of how brutal such an enterprise can become. And it's survived 74 years, and in those 74 years, it just got so many millions of Palestinians outside of Palestine. Half of the Palestinians live out of Palestine. This is a success of Zionism. However, the fact that half of the Palestinians are still in Palestine is understood by Israel as its greatest failure. And I think we should accept that. We should accept that the Palestinians have managed through Sumud to hold on to parts of their land and to claim the other parts and to claim equality and freedom, which they haven't got. So that's, I put that on your blackboard if you want. Now, of course, to get rid of about 7 or 6.5 million Palestinians is not a realistic option for Israel. They can't kill them. I'm saying they can't. Of course they can, but how will they do that without the world intervening? And I believe that if they try to do it, and I might be wrong, and please argue with me, but you know, if you want, we'll discuss it in the question, but I'm saying, in my view, this is not an option. The option is to ethnically cleanse them. And these plans are openly discussed in the Israeli parliament and represented by political parties. This is something very important to remember. Well, in order to do that, you'll need the army. You'll need a very strong army. And if they got rid of two-thirds of the Palestinians in 1948, when the army was much smaller and weaker, it would be easy for them to do it again on a larger scale. Now, to end this section, I want to say Israel is a militarized polity, meaning it's more militarized than any other so-called democratic state that you may suggest. You can only compare it to North Korea. I don't know any other examples that one can compare it to. And when I say militarized, I'll talk about this in the second part, but the fact that you can't compare it is not just because of the structure of the army, but because of the functions of the army. The function of the Israeli army, and this is the most important bit of this part, is to give an Israeli identity to the millions of Jews that came from all over the world and did not share an identity between them other than religion. And that was not enough. They didn't speak the same language. Their religious affiliation was not the same. You know about Ashkenazis and Sephardis, etc. So there wasn't something to hold them together. And Ben-Gurion writes and says, when he speaks many times during 1948 to 1954, in those 6 years, he developed this argument that the whole nation is the army, which is really a quote from a Prussian general. In order to have, he said in 1950, we have a state, we have an army, but we don't have a people yet. And that was a very astute thing to note. And in order to create a people, he used the army because it was the biggest, most powerful, most democratic, in a sense, for Jews, institution in Israel. It was the institution of Israel, and it stayed there for the 74 years since that period. More than 96% of the Jewish population back every attack by the Israeli army. Now, you know, such percentages are unknown in any other country. Probably in Ukraine, you can't even achieve it now. 96%, you remember the numbers from Soviet Russia, when 99% of the people voted and they all voted for the leadership. These were invented figures probably, but 96% in Israel support, or sometimes higher, supporting the IDF in whatever it does is not an invented figure. It is a real figure, of course, of Jews, not of all Israelis, but of Israeli Jews. And I would want to understand how this is achieved in the second part. I just want to end by saying that the other thing that is very different about the Israeli army is it touches every part of the Israeli society and dictates it and forms it. It doesn't matter if we're talking about finance, industry, education, health, sports, media, publishing, theater, arts, or even sexual therapy, which, because it's so interesting, no, I can't open it apparently. But I think I'll leave it here. I made the case for the first part and see if there are any questions.
Yes, let's see. Can I ask, please, the people who were picking up the questions, is there anyone who's actually asked any questions or made any comments at this stage, Paula or Bob?
Yes, Diana Nelson has a question. Why do so many 1948 Palestinians trust the army which oppresses them?
Sure. They trust the army more than they trust the politicians, but that is typical of all Israelis. They trust the army not because they support it. Of course they don't support it. What they do is they trust the army to do what it's meant to do, which is in many times against them. For example, they don't trust the army when it comes to stories about Palestinians, but they trust the army when it is saying what it plans to do. For example, to build here, to build there, to support the settlements and so on. So these they trust more than what the politicians are actually doing. But it also means that the 1948 Palestinians, as you called them, have spent a long time living with Israelis. And they know that all the Israelis, for for any practical measure, most Israelis are in the army. So what the army says speaks for Israel. That is what it means that they trust the army, not that they trust the army to do anything positive, or they trust the army to help them. You can imagine that Palestinians living in Israel, over the last few weeks, remember in last May what happened in Palestine, that on both sides of the Green Line, Palestinians went into the streets in great numbers. And this year, it happened in May, not by chance, but by Israel's behavior in Al-Aqsa. You remember what happened during the beginning of May, etc. So in all universities, the Shabak, the security service, the police and militarized police are hunting Palestinian activists in the open, and the universities are not supporting the Palestinian students. So Israeli Palestinians know what the army is about. The army is about freeing Palestinians from their land, or freeing the land from its Palestinians. That's the main story. And they trust the army to do that.
Have we any more questions, Tola, sorry, from the Tola and so on? Have any more questions?
Okay, yes, sorry.
Just one thing I'd like to say.
Yes.
Haim, you mentioned that in 1948, apartheid became a reality, but apartheid, it was only actually codified in 1948. Apartheid started in 1910 with the Act of Union, because it was an apartheid state from that point on, which is why the African Congress had gone to Britain to demand that it not be created, but they didn't win. So I think I just wanted to say that.
Thanks, Diana. This is a very important point, and of course I'm aware of it, but I thought that it's too nice not to mention that two apartheid states were established in 1948, which is a fact. The other thing is that Israeli apartheid did not start in 1948. It was only codified in 1948, and it started with the beginning of Zionist population of Palestine and occupation. So, for example, in 1926, 26 villages were expelled in one day in the Jezreel Valley, supported by the British police and the Haganah. Yeah, the whole operation was securitized by those two military forces. We're talking about tens of thousands of people losing their home in one night, yeah, or day. So this, you know, apartheid did not start in 1948, but both countries, South Africa and the State of Israel, codified it in 1948.
Okay, so any more questions, Tola?
Yes, there's a question from Stephen Watters, or Watters. Can you give us a model answer to the question, does Israel have the right to exist? And he has said to me, in a nutshell, no. But what should we highlight, emphasize when explaining the reasoning?
Well, this should take the whole night, but I'll try and outline where the answer is.
Can I suggest, Haim, that maybe we might take that right at the end? Because it could.
I think it's a good idea.
Yeah.
But I trust you to remember it in the end. Yeah.
And to wind up. Yeah. Is that right, Stephen, whoever's asked it? Do you mind?
Yeah, we'll ask it at the end.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, fine. So anything more comments, questions? No.
Can I just comment on? Can I just comment on that last question?
Yeah.
About the right to exist. We were asked that.
I mean, if I might hold that, because I'm pushed for time.
I'll be very quick, Robin.
Could you hold when you come in on your comment? Would you come in at the end when we finish the whole thing? We're going to take that comment and the question and the whole point back at the end of the whole session. Is that all right? The reason I want to do that is because I think it actually does envelop a whole lot of the issues which I'm going to now extend onto.
Okay, so the second part is really about the development of the army after the late 40s and the early 50s. The one thing that exemplifies that development more than any other is the Israeli military-industrial complex, or I should call it really the Israeli military-industrial academic complex, because it could not exist without the complicity and full cooperation of Israel's 8 universities. Enormous amounts of money change hands between the army and the universities, between the US and the universities, between the EU and the universities and the army. And actually, you can't really tell the difference sometimes. So I want to talk about the uses that the military-industrial complex has achieved during the years. The first one is really building an industrial base in Israel. Israel, as I said, was not, Palestine was not an industrial country. Yeah, before 1948, the main industries were things like the petrol and gas, purification in Haifa. This was the largest industrial complex. And the Second World War helped Zionism, and I'm spending a lot of a lot of my new book, which hasn't come out yet, on that process in between 39 and 1945. Palestine was an agrarian country, mainly non-industrialized, but Zionism industrialized itself because it was a modern national movement, nationalist movement. And that meant that the main reason it industrialized is to create, to build arms. And it built arms in the Second World War because they knew that after the war, they will have to fight for Palestine. The Palestinians didn't understand this. They trusted the British. Let me say, whoever trusts the British should see a psychiatrist, and quick. And I say this at every time I speak in Britain and elsewhere, because the British have created the Palestine problem. Of course, they used Zionism and Zionism used them, but without the British mandate, there wouldn't be a Palestine problem. That's the first thing. The British needed an industrial base when they were in Palestine, and they were quite happy for the Zionists to build it, and they used it. After all, during the war, there are 150,000 British soldiers stationed in Palestine. So this is how the military-industrial complex starts during the war. And it, apart from building an industry, later on, it built international influence. Now, at the moment, according to Israel, it is supplying arms to 140 or 139, depending when you look at the numbers, 140 countries. I think it's more than that. There's about 200 nations registered as UN members. Some of them are the size of Crouch End, so they can be disregarded and they don't have an army. But I think they supply more than 140, and this is the only number they admit to, and they don't admit to the identity of those states. So they supply most of the world with arms, and they range between number 5 and number 7 as arms production country and exportation. So anyone buying, say, jets from Israel, or buying tanks from Israel, or more importantly, buying Pegasus from Israel, is really in Israel's pocket. Israel can terminate, Israel can actually at any point in time say, sorry guys, we don't like what you're doing. We don't quite like you voting against us and for Palestinians at the UN. So you can forget about your spare parts for the jets or the tanks or so on. And this includes many Muslim countries that in the past actually boycotted Israel. Take, for example, Azerbaijan, a small country in the Caucasus that defeated Armenia, that was supported by Russia. And it defeated it with Israeli and Turkish arms. India is the biggest client of Israel. India is a fairly big country, I think. You can put Israel into a corner in India and nobody will know where it's hidden. Yet Israel is supplying India rather than the other way around. That should tell you something. So this is a doctrine of political power by supplying arms, which has been extremely successful, was tried out first in Africa in the 1950s, then in Latin America, later in Asia, and now everywhere. The Chinese, the United States, and Russia are clients of Israel. Need I say more? Now, this is a very important alliance it's a working alliance of the army, academia, finance, industry, politics, research, and diplomacy in a web of common interests. There is no other country in which so many generals serve in government and in the House of Representatives. There never has been, and there won't be, I don't think. United States, the army is very important, but apart from Eisenhower, we can't really come up with names of generals in the 20th or 21st century that are running the country. In Israel, this was quite usual. Very few generals. Trump is an exception and George Bush is another exception, but not many generals are serving in the British government at the moment, or the French, etc. Oh, for that matter, the Russians. And let's look at the Chinese or the Indian or, many other that can be named, obviously not Germany or Italy or blah, blah. Now, this military industrial complex is supplying unique services. What could be more unique than selling Morocco Pegasus when it is used against Macron? I mean, I don't think you can come up with an example quickly. Apart from, of course, a very different example, helping Saudi Arabia to lure a political opponent into an embassy where he was to be cut to pieces and boiled, so that his murder will never be found out about. So, Israel is supplying very unique services to the coup in 2014 in the Ukraine. I want to say something that I can't prove. You might think that there are a lot of political and other refugees from Ukraine in Israel now. You will be wrong. Most of the new refugees that came to Israel in the last 3 months are Russians. And they are the Russian activists against Putin. And Israel is training the next government of Russia once Putin is put out or put down or whatever the Americans plan to do. We don't know if they will succeed, but they really mean it. And the Israelis are the machinery. This is where that government is now being trained, and a lot of it is in the army. Now, the most important thing from my point of view is that Israel is supporting every single dictator, wherever they might be, whatever, there might be Nazis, there might be anti-Semitic, all the better, I mean, every Nazi and anti-Semitic ruler, every dictator is the greatest friend of Israel. They actually vie with each other to suggest that they are better friends than the other one, and so on. You know those details. So I want to say that the best material incarnation of the Zionist colonial project is the MIC. Of course, I'm talking about the IDF, but materially, financially, that's the machinery that makes it all possible is the military-industrial complex. And to finish this end part, I want to talk about the IDF modus operandi. Now, the early founders of the Jewish state, and for that matter, the pre-state militias that formed the basis of the IDF, I'm talking about Ben Gurion, Rabin, Dayan, Sharon, Peres, you know all those names very well, had a very clear modus operandi based on a number of characteristics. One of them is the use of night attacks. This they took from the British, admittedly, from Ord Wingate, but they managed to improve on that. And Ord Wingate, which is a hero of Israel, was a Christian Zionist and was a murderer per se. He personally murdered, we don't know how many, but probably few hundred Palestinians with his handgun. It was so shocking to the Israeli murderers that were with him, including Moshe Dayan, for example, that they complained that he's killing too many people. For example, the system was during the Palestinian uprising of 36 to 39, rounding up all the men, not asking any questions, just counting 1 to 10, kill. 11, 12, 20, kill. So this is what is called decimation by the Roman historians. Decimation from decimal, yeah? You kill every 10th person. And, Wingate knew his classics, and therefore he acted like the Romans. So you can imagine what this did to Palestinians in the villages. Everyone is looking at the village, square where all the men are lined up, and every 10th person is killed. And what can they do? There are, hundreds of soldiers, both Jewish and British, around them. They can't do anything. So the night attacks, as you well know, the IDF attacks every night hundreds and sometimes thousands of homes in Palestine. Not because they're looking for someone, not because they think that they will find something, no. Sometimes also that, but they're doing it in order to remind Palestinian who is boss, who is in control, who will say who lives and who dies. And in that sense, they're very successful. They're getting away with it. The Russians are not getting away with anything, even with the things they didn't do, they don't get away with. The Israelis are getting away with all that they're doing and more. So this is one thing. The other thing is, the other method of the modus operandi of the IDF was brutal preemptive attacks. You don't wait to be attacked because it's a small country and it can't really very easily protect itself against attacks. So you will decide when you preempt an attack that might or might not be happening, but you decide and you attack. And this was, of course, the Suez War in 1956, when 3 military powers attacked a peaceful Egypt that didn't attack anybody. This is true in 1967, and this is true throughout. So this is another method that you're not really waiting for a casus belli, legally or militarily. You just act when you think you're up, when you're on top, and you don't wait. And then the retaliations against civilian populations is another, I've already discussed that. So this is another modus operandi that has never changed. In other words, what is called collective punishment, which is actually illegal according to so many modes of international legislation. It's not true. You can't really punish armies very easily, and you can't punish armies all the time, but you can punish, not just population under your control, but populations of the enemy. For example, before 1956, it was totally normal for Israel to go into Jordan, the West Bank mainly, but not only, and into Egypt, say in the Gaza Strip, and kill civilians, mainly Palestinians, but not only. You know, they were never punished for doing that by the UN or by anybody else. They were never, to this day, under investigation, and this continues. You know what they're doing in Gaza, you know what they're doing in the West Bank, you know what they're doing in Jerusalem, and for that matter, they're doing it in Israel. They're doing it to Palestinian citizens of Israel living in the Negev, in the Galilee, etc. So basically, collective punishment is a very important part of the menu that Israel applies to the Palestinians. And it might have been learned from the British and the other, you know, unsavory European armies like the Nazis, etc. But they innovated quite a lot in this area.
Okay, a break now, Haim. Is that all right?
Yeah, okay, we can break, yeah.
Okay. We'll see if we might have more questions. Have we got any more questions, folks? More comments? Chat? Sorry?
Oh, sorry, we don't have any new questions. We still have, oh no, we do. Okay.
The ones we'll deal with at the end.
So this is Pilar Morara Margaret, who says, Haim, you mentioned the role in the Israeli MIC as a tool for democracy. How much international support for Israel do you think is motivated by this compared to, e.g., the influence of Israel's more powerful allies, mainly the US? Thank you.
I'll try and answer it very quickly, but clearly. I don't think that I said that the MIC is a support force for democracy. I mean, it's support against democracy in the main. So that's first thing. Secondly, you know, it's supporting dictators. So how could it be supporting democracy? It's supporting regimes against people. It's supporting regimes against the people who are trying to get democracy. Remember Israel's support to, you know, Pinochet, yeah, Israel's support to Idi Amin, etc. I mean, you name it. So Israel has never supported democracy.
Well, can I just say that I read that wrong as a tool for diplomacy?
Yeah, okay.
So
sorry, I thought it must have been.
Sorry.
Yeah, I should have worked this out.
I think
yeah, now I can't calculate, and I don't think anybody can, percentages, but frankly, the combined effect of the power of the, let's say, Anglophone countries, because we can call it the West, but it's a misnomer in a sense. If we're talking about the West, we're talking about the Anglophone countries. These are the criminals. This is a criminal fraternity that has been working for so long. It's unbelievable. And it's doing a very good job now, making sure that there is no peace in Ukraine, for example. So this fraternity is supporting Israel a long time before it was, when it was still a dream of few Zionists in Palestine, and it's still supporting it. And in this country, every party leader is supporting Zionism, unqualified supporter of Zionism. Now, only one of them said he's an unqualified supporter, but actually all of them are unqualified supporters. They just don't call it that way. Mm. So the combined power, political power of the Anglophone countries, yes, and the power of Israel as political, financial, and military actor is making it impossible for most countries to vote against Israel in the UN. I think percentages are beyond us, I think, in here.
Yeah. Do you want to, any more questions, folks? Sorry, Tola. Any more comments?
I think John wants to ask a question.
Oh, there is another one from Diana Nestlin. This is not a defense force. Sorry?
Is it specific to the military-industrial complex, or is it to a wider question? We might take all the rest at the end, because I'm getting worried about time. Sorry to be rude about this.
Shall I just...
What's Diana think? Is that all right with Diana? If that's all right with her.
And there's John Chapman has a message as well.
Yeah.
Which is, do the Navy and Air Force have a distinct status and function?
Okay, I think that's easy to answer, and it's short. Right. The Navy and Air Force have a distinct identity. They didn't to begin with so much, but that has developed a bit like it is in Anglophone countries as well. It's closer to America than to the US than to Britain, but it's very, very similar. For the first time in 2006, the commander of the Air Force became the commander of the army, of the IDF, in other words, the chief of the general staff. And I think I should mention the war in 2006 because it's an example which is very interesting. The next thing, I assume this is the last question of this section, am I right?
Mm.
Well, Diana asked...
Oh, right, sorry.
Sorry, Diana was saying it isn't a defense force, so why do so many people still continue to use the term IDF?
Well, it's called the IDF. It's like Britain is called a democracy. It doesn't mean that it is a democracy. You know, or it's called all kind of different names. Things are called, you know, things are called different names, but, you know, somebody wrote on my Facebook, why do I call the IDF the IDF? I don't call it the IDF. They call it the IDF. I actually, most of the time, call it the IOF, the Israeli Occupation Army. But when I wanted to use that as a title of my book, the publisher wouldn't bear it. He said, you know, the legal name of the IDF is the IDF, and I think you have to use that. So I think these are games. You know, if I call it the IOF, I know I don't change anything. And if they call it the IDF, they don't change anything either.
Yeah. Okay, thanks. Thanks. Is that okay, Tola? That's how far we've got?
Yes, apart from the...
Yeah, the one at the end.
Yeah, at the end. Okay.
I'm not sure how we might slightly overrun, but I'm finding this fascinating. I don't know whether other people are, but they don't seem to be worried about it. So we'll keep going, Haim, but try and keep it to 15 minutes and see how much discussion we can have.
I'll do my best. In a sense, dividing it into three is probably making it longer, as you can see, but there we are.
I think
the first thing I want to, I'm rushing it. The first thing I want to deal with, which is important, is the IDF really such an excellent army as they publicize themselves to be? I think the evidence is against that. And a number of chapters in the book are presenting the failures of the IDF. Now, I'm not interested in failure or success. What I'm interested in is the huge trust that Israelis put on the IDF, and they put that trust on it because it is successful, in quotes. It is successful only in one task, but that task happens to be the most important, and that is to keep the Palestinians at bay and to get rid of as many Palestinians as possible at any point in time. You will remember that in 1967, part of the victory was the immediate ejection of 250,000 Palestinians out of Jerusalem and the areas around it. Nobody has taken Israel to task. This is not Ukraine. So the army is doing its job the real job very, very well. The other job, which is fighting the Arab countries, it doesn't do very well. Remember the war in 1973. I won't go into it, but you know, I have a long chapter on it, and it is basically about the self-delusions of the Israelis about their own powers. That's very important to understand, that the Israelis don't see themselves realistically, that they think that everything is possible for them. And that's why they are much more militaristic and adventurist than reality is suggesting. So if you want to understand why Israel is involved in more wars than any other country that ever existed in the period of 74 years of its existence, this is the answer. Israel does not know any other modus operandi apart from war. It never tried real peace, even with the countries with which it is signed on with a peace agreement, like Egypt, like Jordan, etc. There is no real peace. Of course, there is never real peace. As far as Israel is concerned, there never will be with the Palestinians. But even with countries that it has peace agreements with, there is no real peace. So in 1973, just a few months before the war, Sharon, Dayan, and others, the commanders of the intelligence forces, for example, gave interviews saying that in the next 10 to 20 years, no Arab country can attack Israel. They just don't have the wherewithal, the will, the knowledge, the training, or the soldiers to attack Israel. This was said few weeks even before the war started. And when the war started, the shock to Israel, not just to the army and to its failure in intelligence terms, but its failure to defend the first line or even the second line. They failed. Both lines failed immediately. And it took something like 17 days to regain control of those lines. So the Israeli army would like to argue that it's the best army in the world. I'm sure Putin would also argue that his army is the best in the world. And so will the Americans. We remember the American army in Vietnam. Those armies are shitty. I'm against every war that one can think of. I'm totally against war, and especially war against civilians. But I think those armies are not as good as they try to let us believe in. And to end this, I want to talk about 2006. But in your background memory, remember 1982, when 140,000 Israeli soldiers attacked 5,000 soldiers of the PLO. Okay, remember the numbers? 140,000 one side, 5,000 to 6,000 badly trained, and poorly provided for and armed Palestinian activists, mainly volunteers. Yeah, the Palestinians were not defeated. They were not defeated. What was defeating them in the end, and that forced them into the ships that left to Tunis, was the Americans. The Americans have managed to force Arafat to leave Lebanon, not the Israelis. So this is 1982. In 2006, Israel fought for 33 days against Hezbollah. Again, Hezbollah had probably less than 10,000 soldiers. Israel put into Lebanon 125,000 soldiers in the end. It bombed South Lebanon for 33 days. for the whole duration. It destroyed the electricity, the water, the gas, anything, telephone, all the infrastructure, and not for the first time, and not for the second time, remember, yeah? So Israel destroys South Lebanon at will, illegally, brutally, needlessly, and cannot defeat Hezbollah. And Hezbollah has created the fact that 1.5 million Israeli citizens leave their homes for fearing Hezbollah rockets. So who has won this, I ask you, yeah? So remember that the fact that the MIC sells its arms because it, in a sense, has tested in action written on those products, yeah? Action against the Palestinians, action against Hamas, action against the Iranians, action against the Egyptians, action against the Syrians, the Iraqis, and of course, Lebanon, Hezbollah, etc. And indeed, some other countries in Africa, Libya and so on. So you can't really even have a full list of this for lack of time. So this is not an army which is functional in any way that a normal army is functional. Its main function and its only success is its total suppression of the Palestinians. This is what its function is, and this is what they keep such a powerful army for. And I want to end by talking about the functions of the army today. I said that its main function is to suppress resistance and demonstrate its control in Palestine. It is an army of land confiscation, yeah? It is an army of theft of land and natural resources, especially water, but not only. It is an army of settlement. That's why I said you can't compare it to the British army, to the Chinese army, to the Russian army, because none of the other armies in the world are doing all those things. But this is a small part of what the army is doing. It is an army of denying daily life to every Palestinian in the territories. It's denying a woman who needs to get to hospital to give birth passage to hospital. It is denying students who need to get to university free passage. It is denying people who are going to visit their family 2 miles away in the next village entrance to that village. It's denying nightly peace to Palestinians because they can't ever sleep, because there will be the broken down door, there will be the attack, there will be the dragging out of the whole family dressed as it is or undressed into the courtyard and frightening the children, beating up the men, taking people to prison. This is the kind of army we're talking about. It is the army denying Palestinian expansion of any sort, for example, building permissions, building permits for family members, yeah? Family unification, It is denying students that went to study in the UK coming back home to Gaza or to the West Bank or to Jerusalem. They are not allowed in because they did not live for so many years, or for a year, or for so many months in Palestine. And who is there to stop them doing that? It is an army that destroys thousands of Palestinian homes illegally, unnecessarily, totally needlessly, and brutally. And you know that Palestinians have to pay for the homes to be, if the army destroys it, they get a bill for the destruction. and believe you me, the army charges quite steeply for that destruction work. And some of them are given a chance to save, destroy your own home and save. This could be, their slogan. It is the army that denies employment rights. People are not allowed to get to their employment place, to their education. It denies health, as I said, denies free movement, denies family life, denies ownership rights, denies tilling your own land, which is basically separated from you, or you're separated from it, etc. And to end, it's not really the end, but I think it'll have to be. The punitive system that Israel is used is based on license granting. Everything needs a license. To see your brother in jail needs a license, and you have to apply, and you won't get it, okay? To appear in court, the Palestinian lawyer needs a license that can be denied them, and that is never explained why it was denied. Anyone that wants to come to court needs a license, and they won't get it. And everyone is fined all the time. You fined for tilling your land. You fined for building a kitchen outdoors, etc. Everything is confiscated all the time. Tractors were confiscated from an agricultural college for reasons never specified. So try and teach your students when the tractors were taken by the IDF in the middle of the night. This is just a small example. This happens all the time. I'm not even mentioning has demolitions.
I have to stop you, Haim, right? I have to slow you down.
Yeah.
I have to stop what you're saying because I've been there and seen a lot of that.
I'm sure quite a lot of your members have seen it. Yeah.
And it was bloody awful 6 years ago, but even worse now, right? But I want to let people have come in and ask you and talk to you.
Okay,
right? So,
I leave it at that.
So let's Tula, how are the people coming in?
Okay, so I'm wondering if should Tony do his question first, or the Stephen?
I think he should. Yeah.
Okay, yeah. And should Tony can just talk, can't he? Now I think.
Yeah, I mean, firstly, I'm sorry I didn't come to hear the first part of your talk, but unfortunately I had another Zoom meeting on Ukraine. But I say my apologies for what has obviously been a very interesting talk. I was only going to respond to the original question, which is about Israel's right to exist. And my answer to that has always been that no state has the right to exist. The people in the state have the right to exist. States are not human beings. And in particular, when it comes to a racist state, a settler colonial state, there is certainly no right to exist. The South African state didn't have a right to exist. The Nazi state didn't have a right to exist. And many similar states don't have no right to exist. This is simply a get out by Israel as a way of evading its responsibilities and for what it's done in the past.
Thanks. That's a very interesting point, actually, Tony. Because I don't know whether the person who asked the question originally would like to ask further, but I think that's a very interesting point because, in fact, states are only a 19th century invention anyway.
Can I just say something about the UK
Yes.
and its right to exist? The UK is a creation, a colonial creation of English control of 3 other nationalities. We all know the first colonial project of modernity is Ireland. and brutal it was for 350 years. And it's still going on in part of Ireland. So at the moment, if somebody says the UK, of course, has a right to exist, they're talking rubbish, because the UK, in all probability, will not exist for very long as it now stands. And there are the two reasons you all know, Scotland and Ireland. And then others will follow, like Wales. So states don't have a right to exist.
Can I
People
ask,
decide how they want to organize the state that they live in.
But Britain never
is there any
about
other
the right to
comments,
exist.
Paula? Any other comments from people? Because I'd like to.
So I think. Oh,
Hmm?
have I muted or unmuted? Oh, unmuted. Yeah, I think Stephen might want to ask his own question. The one, let me have a look, about Israel's right to exist. Does Stephen want to ask that?
Well, I think it's been answered, to be honest, by Haim with that answer about the British Isles, to be honest. So
Yeah.
but in saying that though, like, you know, it might help to make it more applicable to Israel in terms of like what was his name, like Herzl or something like that, you know, like in 1896, you know, like I don't know, like, can you help us with like an answer?
Yeah.
Sorry, I'm not sure what you're referring to, because I missed some of the sound.
Can
Just
you clarify, Stephen?
you know, just make it specific. Yeah. I think it's a cracking point about the UK and Scotland and England and Wales, but like, could you make it specific to Israel and like
Sure.
Herzl in 1896 about, because it's a settler colonial like project, you know, so like just.
Well, I think Tony is right.
Yeah.
No apartheid state has a right to exist. Apartheid state is a crime. Yeah, so it has to be wound up. Secondly, even Herzl didn't call for a Jewish state. Judenstaat is a state of the Jews, not a Jewish state. Yeah. So first of all, to say that they have a right to a Jewish state is nonsensical. Because they want to include me as a Jew living in Britain in their state. And, you know, so that every Jew can become an Israeli just by decision. They don't even need to come to Israel to get a passport. They get a passport when they are abroad. We don't accept that. This is Zionism at its worst. So they don't have a right to exist, A, as an apartheid state, B, as a colonial project, C, as you know, a terrible force in the Middle East serving imperialism and capitalism. So I don't see any right to exist of any state, but least of all that of Israel.
I think that's a very interesting argument back, because it's the sort of question that we get on the when we're giving out leaflets and so on. You know, when we're doing our work with the public, what about the Jewish state? Occasionally we get that. We think, well, why should there be a right to have a state at all? And B, why should there be a Jewish state? And why? It's particularly important with our local protests, which we run quite frequently every 3 weeks or so, because people realise that there are quite a lot of Jewish people live in the neighbourhood, and they don't support a Jewish state. So
there's a lot of Jewish people in PSC.
They've just been living for years and years and years. I mean, Glyn will know much better than me, but Glyn and Vanessa, who are on this call, that there were quite a few members of our local PSC who were Jewish, and we never even knew they were Jewish because they've been completely British for so long, it didn't matter. You know, I mean, they'd never been anything else.
Just remember, if I may, just remember for a moment that the Palestinians accepted, they didn't have to, accepted the rights of Israeli Jews to live with them in peace in Palestine as
Yes.
full citizens in equality.
And I want to
No
ask
Israeli Jew, no Zionist Jew, I should say, has ever accepted the right of the Palestinian to live in their own country.
Yeah.
So we're talking about no one has a problem, least of all the Palestinians, with
Yeah.
allowing Jews to live in their own country. Yeah.
Can I just, has any others people got any questions? Because I want to ask one more.
Can I just make one other comment?
Yes,
Robin?
please do.
Yeah, I find there's a psychological aspect to this, because although, I mean, the British state has no right to exist, I've never heard a defender of British imperialism saying that Britain has a right to exist, whereas with Israel, they always say it has a right to exist. And the reason why they say it is because they know it doesn't have a right to exist. They know that it's illegitimate.
Excellent point.
Yeah. I wanted to ask something completely different, which is how do we go ahead most effectively against this? What do you think? For example, with the military-industrial complex, and I go into political waters here, well, we all are, Palestine Action and Elbit. How important is Elbit within the military-industrial complex? How important is that action, do you think, Haim, in terms of how it goes? I mean, we have in our membership individually quite a few people who support them.
I think that the most important action now taken against Zionism and its expansion is taken in Britain by Palestine Action. Elbit is one of the largest, it's the largest Israeli conglomerate of security, so the so-called security. And basically, death and destruction is called security, but this is part of the game. It is selling arms to all those countries I mentioned. It has an enormous amount political power in many countries. It decides who rules the country through the links with the regime, military leadership. Yeah, and it is producing for Britain and in Britain for Israel to export to other countries. So I think that the action, the real action and the real heroism of a small group of activists against Elbit is going a very long way to supplying a model for action against Israel. They didn't just choose Elbit because it was easy. They chose Elbit because it was difficult, because they are powerful, because they are a symbol of the MIC, the Israeli MIC, and because they are everywhere, and because they are involved in the American and British MIC just like that, you know? So attacking Elbit is also attacking those other military industrial complexes which are vile and which are evil and which we must get rid of in our country here in Britain as well. So this is a very intelligent choice, and I think we should all support it and should take part in it. And to quote Tony, who is an activist with Palestine Action, you don't have to be able to climb the wall. Tony is a getaway driver, as he told us a number of times. And, you know, if I ever plan to rob a bank, Tony, you'll be the driver. So, you know, all of us could play a role in this, even at my age. So I think we should remember that. So Elbit is not by chance. Elbit is not a mistake. Is an important part of the aggressive machine of Israeli control of Palestine and other countries, and that's why they are attacked, and they should be attacked, and they should be expelled from any country. And we, the people of those countries, can do it.
Thank you. Has anyone else got any comments about that or anything else before I finish? No? Anyone else want to thank Haim? Thank you very much, Haim, for a wonderful presentation. I think it was absolutely fascinating, and update even on your book. And I'm really pleased to have had this, and we had 40 people actually here at the time. They're nearly 40 now. And I'm sure many of them would have liked to have engaged more.
Can I just have a sentence to end it?
Of course.
I just wanted to say that we are more or less on the Nakba Day. We're just a few days off. And Nakba Day was very unusual this year because of the murder of this amazing woman, Shireen Abu Akla, and what has happened in the whole world because of this brutal murder. And I wanted also to say that something I could not talk about tonight, but is very well developed in the book, is the system of lies, denials, inventions, and deflections that the Israelis are using, which they use in this murder. First, they murder in order to silence a voice, an Arab voice, a Palestinian voice, a female voice. What more do you want? And a voice of a courageous woman that did not actually, that had no fright all these years, because she knew she can die any moment. And indeed, they killed her in the end. But her name would live. And she is the best known journalist in the world today. And she has become a symbol. I wanted to remind you that, and to take that memory with you and to discuss it and not let it die.
That's absolutely right. I totally and utterly support that. I'm sorry. And I also wanted to say that there was an extraordinary article in Time magazine this week about the Israeli denials and deflections of trying to of killing Palestinians for the last 20 years, which has been provoked by Shireen. It was in Time magazine in the United States, which was astonishing, and it's very long. I have it somewhere on my emails. I mean,
the first thing they do when they kill someone is say Palestinians killed them.
That's right. Well, that's it. And then of course it all got blown up because the what we call it, the how you actually work out GMS or something, GMP, that they were that the Al-Haq actually worked that they clearly couldn't be in the same place. And of course there was the original testimony. It's all on YouTube. The original testimony of the guy who was shot in the back he's on YouTube as well. But the thing is about it, that what I thought was extraordinary, and this was Time magazine running a long article detailing all the deflections and attempts of Israel to do it, and a whole string of cases made from 2000 onwards. It was Time last weekend, early this week.
Oh, can I just say I missed somebody's question? Is there time for it? It was Pilar, and she says, you mentioned the function of the IDF in oppressing and terrorizing the Palestinian population. Could you comment on the role military courts play in this system of oppression, and how are these perceived by Israeli society?
Well, the military courts are not courts at all. They are monkey courts. This is a monkey system of law. It's all illegal. The whole legal system of Israel is illegal. It is against international law. It is denying international law. It is denying the Geneva Convention. It is denying every convention, for example, the Atomic Convention and many others, the Chemical and Biological Convention, Arms Convention, it is denying the Human Rights Convention, which is the first convention of the UN, and is denying every signed international agreement, including the ICC. It refuses to join the ICC. It refuses to allow the ICC to hold its investigations in Israel, like the United States, another criminal country that refuses international law and has the power to break it. So first of all, this is to be said about the whole Israeli system, not just about the military court. The military courts, the success rate, if you can call it that, is 99%. 99% of Palestinians are found guilty. I have no idea why 1% of Palestinians were found not guilty. I really can't work it out. This is a great mystery. And the only solution I would like to suggest to you is that 100% success would look wrong. So, 99% looks, well, 1% better than the wrong of 100%. This is the only reason that they find 1% of the Palestinians not guilty. When they find someone not guilty, they don't find him not guilty. They find that the prosecution has not managed to prove their guilt. Okay, they're not guilty.
Chaim, it's not 99%; it's 99.7%.
Yes,
So,
you're right. Yeah, but I think it's good enough. Yeah, it's good enough. You're right. I think probably there was some mistake. So they got 0.3%, off. So this is said about the whole system, not about the military court, because the Israeli High Court is supporting law-breaking, war crimes, confiscations, breaking of international law. It is the legal device of making crime allowable and acceptable and impunity and providing impunity. In a sense, I can think of very few examples that have gone so far. I think I would rather not mention the examples you all know about, because we will just be attacked for that. So the Israeli legal system from top to bottom is wrong, is illegal, and is acting against the citizens. And I'm not just saying that it's acting against Arab citizens. A lot of Israeli citizens, for example, if you're left wing, there are not many, as you know, in Israel that are on the left, and you are standing as a Jew, an Israeli Jew, with Palestinians, and on a Nakba day in a university, you'll be beaten up to pulp. You have no rights whatsoever, and no one will be found to have done something wrong. How many Palestinians were killed in the last year, in the last 10 years, in the last 20 years? How many Palestinians were killed since 1948? Do you know the number? We're talking about tens of thousands, sometimes in a decade, okay? Was somebody actually guilty for all these murders? Who were they actually committed by, and who is guilty for them? So I think that it's wrong to isolate the military courts because it's easy. As Tony says, 99.7%, this is obviously not a court system. And, the law doesn't mean anything. Of course not. But even the rest of the legal system in Israel is corrupt, is illegal, and is supporting those crimes. It's not just the army that commits the crime. It's the politicians, it's the educationalists, it's the professors, it's the people that research for the army. It's the whole social support system that is supporting that large, important, rich, powerful institution in Israel. So don't separate Israeli military courts. That's my advice. Robin, we can't hear you.
Yeah, I'm just coming in now to say we're overrun somewhat. Ravi, is that all right? Are you okay on the Zoom?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah. I don't know whether people would like to continue a little bit longer. I don't get any sense, although we've still got 35 people on the line. So maybe they're quite happy to continue with the discussion till say 9:30. I don't know. Have you got anyone got any sense of this or not? No?
I'm at your service if you need any more comments.
Yeah, we'll just see if there's any more taller. If there's any more people would like to make comments or yeah.
Kevin had a question, which was, are there any Palestinians in the IDF? I think there were Bedouin, weren't there, at one time?
Yes, there were Bedouins and Druze. The Bedouin community is supposedly not Arab, which, well, and when you read about Arabia, you know that this is the country of the Bedouins. So to say that the Bedouins are not Arabs and not Palestinians is just serving the IDF. It's not serving anybody else, least of all the Bedouins themselves. The Bedouins in Israel are brutally attacked. They are the most oppressed community of all Palestinians in Israel. And they are forced to serve, the men, that is, are forced to serve. And this is a very important thing now, because about 50% of Jews, that is Jewish males, find one way or another not to serve in the army. I don't know if you knew that. At one point in time, it was near 100% of Israeli Jews who served in the army. Now, it is about between 49 and 50%, depending on the year, yeah? So depending on the cohort, really. Soon, most Israeli Jews will not serve in the army because it's not a professional army. This is supposed to be the army is the people, and the people is the army. That's where we started today. But because so many Jews are willingly refusing to serve in the army and find legal ways of doing it, like, you know, they are nervous, they are this, they are that, they are very religious, they are, you know. So, and the army is playing along with that because it doesn't want unwilling soldiers. It wants automatons. It wants soldiers that will never refuse an order. That's one thing. The other thing is that at one point in time, religious people were a small minority in the army. Now they are most of the Jewish soldiers of the army, yeah? And they are messianic, racist, for apartheid, for oppressing, and in any Pew study that was held in the last 10 years, were against any political rights to any Arab. That means to any Palestinian in Palestine, and any part in Palestine, yeah? In Gaza, in the West Bank, and in Israel, and in all the territories of Palestine, they are against having political rights for those people of any kind. So you can say for sure that if you thought that Israeli democracy are going to produce a peaceful solution, a just solution, you can forget about that. This was never the case. And now, mathematically, it can't be, because these people are totally against political rights for the Palestinians. Now, a lot of the others are, but once the majority are religious, that's the end of it. And this can only grow because the religious community has a 2.5 index of birth numbers, yeah? The average birth rate in the religious and Orthodox community is 2.5 that of the non-religious community. So Israel is going to be a little Vatican or a big Vatican, yeah. Well, with the Vatican, you can get, you know, somewhere, or not with Israel, yeah. So this is one thing. Glyn, I think, wants to ask a question. I really would love to hear you, Glyn.
Thanks, Haim. Brilliant talk. I just a very quick question to answer, I hope. What proportion of the Israeli economy does the military complex account for?
Well, this is very difficult to answer because very little of the Israeli economy is untouched by that. So there are so many ways in which this is happening. For example, mathematicians in the Technion and Israeli universities are working on theories that are then used by other mathematicians in the MIC to produce software of all kinds and hardware of all kinds that is based on their work. I mean, is that they didn't produce it necessarily for that, but it is used for that. Chemists, physicists, you know that no Arab can learn physics or chemistry or aeronautics or space studies or so many others in an Israeli university. They're not accepted to those areas because they are security risks. So the whole university system is creating an economy not just in economic terms, but as an environment. And so I think that more than 50%, and I think substantially more than 50% of the Israeli economy is directly or indirectly around the MIC. Every company that produces something has got sometimes more than few hundred companies producing parts or producing calculations. By the way, did you know that Israel employed 2,000 Ukrainians in Ukraine on MIC projects, for example? So there are people in India employed by Israel. There are people in China employed by Israel. And Ukraine was a very, very large center of those people. The United States was very nervous that Russia will get to where those people are working and capture them. And, you know, the cat will be out of the bag. And this was part of the calculations of not allowing Kiev to be taken and so on. So it's not just inside Israel. We were talking about Elbit. So thousands of Brits are working for the MIC in Britain, producing stuff that actually supports the Israeli economy. People are working in many countries. People are working in Azerbaijan. I don't know all the countries they're working in because we're just finding out more evidence piecemeal, and it takes time to find the evidence. But I think that most, certainly more than half of the economy is directly and indirectly related to the army. All the new startups, but also the universities are, for example, all the universities are training the army. The Jerusalem University has 2,000 soldiers in a camp, okay, on the campus. Inside the campus, there is a camp, which is surrounded by quite a tall and forbidding wire fence. And they come to study in uniform, carrying arms, etc. And they're part of the campus. This is the case in all universities, but in Jerusalem, it's very visible because it's a very large camp. Every single university and college is training the army. Is this activity part of the security state? I would say yes. So if you calculate all those aspects of the economy, you get a huge number. Israel has doubled its exports in 3 months since the beginning of the war in Ukraine. Did you know that?
I wanted to.
They are dancing about the war. They are really happy about the war.
Sorry, I'm going to have to cut in here. I tell you why, it's a very practical point that I wanted to cut in, actually. About 10 years ago, there was a university college union, or what it was called at the time, a campaign against for boycotting the Israeli universities for exactly the reasons you're talking about, Haim. And in fact, it was one of the active members, as a friend of Glyn's and mine, Mike Cushman, who was very heavily involved in it, right, way back 10 years ago. It went into an employment tribunal. There was a Zionist, took it to employment tribunal against the unions on. The long and the short of it was that the Zionists lost massively. And there was no problem about it. But the union doesn't seem to have taken it up since. And I don't know, I can follow that up with some of the UCU people I know here, and you others might know more about it. But I'm just simply saying that it was because of the link with the military-industrial complex. That was exactly the reason why the boycott was going on.
I think you could do worse than ask Tony to give a talk about unions and their role in supporting Israel in the labor movement.
Yeah, it might be for another day, actually. That would be very helpful. I'm sorry.
Robin, I've got 2 more questions.
Oh, sorry, it's another question.
There are two more.
All right, keep going.
Let's have a look. Well, on the question of Elbit, it's been written twice, but it's rather, does the closure of the Manchester Elbit factory, so the closure of that location for Ferranti Technologies, does that indicate the success of the British-based Palestine Liberation Movement, or something else altogether? As in, do you think that in one case, lenient sentencing of so-called vandals of the Elbit factories is good for the liberation movement, or bad as a precedent for the government to crack down against it?
Very briefly, because of time, of course, it's a success. How else would you look at it? It's a great success that the Manchester plant was closed, and it was closed by Palestine Action. Few people fighting have closed it. And, you know, some Palestinian activists in Palestine itself, and of course others in Lebanon and so on, showed that a small number of people can achieve amazing results. And we know that from other areas on the globe. And I think, what do you mean by lenient? And these people are not vandals. They are not hurting anybody.
That was
They're fighting against war. They're fighting against destruction. They're fighting against death. So I think, you know, the magistrates in Britain seem to be quite sane. They realize that these people are not criminals. They're not vandals. They are not fighting against people, but for them. They're fighting for rights. So they find them not guilty because they are claimed to have acted criminally, but their motive is obviously civic action against brutality. That's the first point I think that we should remember.
I was going to say, unfortunately today, 9 of them been arrested in Bristol, including 2 Israeli citizens, interestingly, in invading the Bristol and attacking the Bristol Elbit quarters. And they were arrested, wait a minute, this morning or last night. But the police were going to bail them, except for the 2 Israelis, strangely enough. But the CPS appealed against the bail, and they're all stuck in prison at the moment. stuck in the police quarters down in Bristol.
Gosh.
So, but there's been no, as Haim was saying, there's been no convictions against them when it comes to the courts. And in fact, generally speaking, in Britain, recently with some of the protesters against the XR protesters and so on, there's been a lot of the wider interest has taken greater knowledge, and the courts have refused to convict any of them.
You said there was two questions.
Oh yes, yes. And can I just say that Claire Rosen Sultan, she put vandals in inverted commas, so called vandals. Yeah. And the other question is
yes, thanks.
About
I went on.
It was about Israel recruiting in the USA and Canada. Hang on, let me just see. Oh, could you comment on Israel recruiting in the USA and Canada?
You would know that in US and Canada, and indeed in this country, it's illegal for a citizen to serve as a hired gun in another country's military service. Yeah, it's illegal apart from Israel. In other words, you know, you remember liberal accept Palestine. So this is liberal accept Israel. Yeah. So these countries have changed their legislation destructively in order to allow the breaking of their own constitution. In Britain, there is no constitution because we don't have human rights. We don't have human rights because we don't have a constitution. Because we are so British that we don't need one. Let us not forget this every time when you wake up in the morning. Remember that you don't have right because you're British, so you don't need rights. So I think that in those three cases, and in some others, like in France, the constitutional duties of the citizen were deformed by the Zionist supportive regime to allow mercenaries from those countries to serve in the IDF. And this was true in 1948. In 1948, around 12% of all the people who fought in the IDF were not Israelis, were not citizens or, residents of Palestine either. They came from Europe and the United States, etc. So this is a long tradition, a long and nasty tradition. And I know personally people who came to fight for the Jews, as they put it, because they're not Jewish themselves. So basically it's a mercenary force. Some of them are moved by what they call idealism. In other words, they believe the Jews have more rights than others. This is also a form of idealism as far as they're concerned. In my book, it is a form of, it's a criminal belief that is distorting human rights. What can I say? These people are mercenaries. These people are war criminals because they participate in war crimes, and the countries that allow them to do that are partners in that crime.
Well said. Well said.
Any more questions, Tola?
I think that's all the questions so far.
Anything you'd like to say yourself?
Good.
Oh, I just think it was very, very brilliant.
I think we've just passed the 2-hour mark, so we've done very well.
It's been a very good evening. It's been an exceptionally good, brilliant evening. And
please read the book, because I haven't said 1% of what the book is saying.
Oh, we should put the name in the chat.
That's how I knew about his private life and his life earlier.
Yeah, going to Verso. The book is now discounted. Buy it from Verso, not from fucking Amazon.
No. Well, Verso it was brilliant. But anyway, thank you so much. It's been such a brilliant evening. And thanks so much for the people who come and ask their questions and ask really good questions and an interesting range of people attending. And thank you very much. Really pleased to see you all.
Thank you.
You for another. We might make another subject time.
Thank you very much.